Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Sonny. I'm the COO at ABC Florida East Coast Chapter. I want to welcome you to episode 14 of the Obvious Podcast.
And my name is Peter Daiga. I'm the president and CEO of the ABC Florida East Coast Chapter.
The Obvious Podcast is a production of ABC Florida East Coast. Unless otherwise stated, all content reflects the opinions of the guests and the hosts, which is us.
And if you like the Obvious Podcast, you can subscribe to it on all the major podcast platforms, such as Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, or Spotify, among others, or watch the audio-visual version on YouTube. You can also follow the Obvious Podcast on Instagram and Twitter. You can always reach out to us via email at theobvious@abceastflorida.com. Links to all the social media feeds are in this episode's show notes. And if you want to help others find the podcast, please leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice, or go to your podcast and search for The Obvious. I did that this recently, and it worked great. So
that's awesome. Well, everybody, welcome. And I'm sure you're wondering why we're back on Zoom. It's because Peter is still at his conference in Arizona. So we just wanted to make sure that there was no lag in content delivery because so many of you are asking for new episodes. So here we are. So Peter, today I wanted to talk to you about something super lighthearted and simple, which is also
like all our podcasts are.
Like all our podcasts, which is something known as the Monroe Doctrine. And I'm sure you remember from history class, it was a foreign policy position that James Monroe took about how any foreign interference in Latin America and South America would be considered hostility towards the U.S. So if you don't know what the Monroe Doctrine is, it's the idea that, his intent really was to kind of stop European colonization of Central and South America. And he wanted it to be clear that this is sort of the U.S.'s backyard and that the U.S. would be the leader and will protect those countries.
Sonny, do you think that was written? You're probably a better student of history on this than I am, but do you think the intent of that was any involvement at all? Because it seems like to me over the decades or perhaps centuries, it's devolved into more military involvement.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's evolved into more. I think Monroe's fear was that, same thing as in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He didn't want potential enemies having not just economic heft in the area, but he didn't want them to be close by, especially with their navies and their armies. And he wanted to make sure that the U.S. was seen as a clear leader of the Americas.
Yeah, because it seems like unless they're moving their ships and their airplanes into the hemisphere, that we really don't talk about the Monroe Doctrine, because quite frankly, I know that's where I think we wanted to spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about. There's been one world superpower that's just been in our backyard big time for many, many years, and just solidifying their presence, their dictatorship over, especially economic circumstances, I think, in a lot of these countries. So
Yeah, so I'm going to look up the exact name so I can tell you. And of course, superpower we're talking about is China. They have just opened, and this is what got Peter and I thinking about this topic. They have just opened the world's largest port in Peru. And it's fascinating to me. There was a huge article in the Wall Street Journal recently about the Chinese influence and the Chinese spending in South America and Latin America. There was a 60 Minutes episode, which, by the way, has just lost all credibility in this last election cycle, but that's a different conversation. But they were talking about how the entire...
The list is long, Sonny. The list is long. It doesn't start or end at 60 minutes, I don't think.
No, that's true. That's very true. But what they did with Kamala's interview, and I certainly don't want to go off topic, but what they did with Kamala's interview, how they attacked Trump 4 years ago when he was interviewed by Leslie Stahl, it was just fascinating to me how they literally just became an arm of the DNC this year.
Yeah.
And there was this, and I'm going to bring this up because I was fascinated by this last Sunday's episode. And our producer hates it when I say last Sunday's episode, but there was a recent episode right before the election that aired where Scott Pelley is interviewing somebody in, I forget the state, I think it was Pennsylvania. And this lady either worked in a diner, or was a manager of a diner, or owned the diner. And she's complaining about inflation. And he says to her, well, inflation's come down by 50%, right? And she's like, well, I don't feel it. And he looked at her like, but I'm telling you, and you should be feeling it. But what irritated me was inflation hasn't come down. The rate of growth of inflation has come down.
That's exactly right.
Right? And I'm
That's
like,
exactly right.
what a smug POS. Like, he's telling her, hey,
And
lady,
my social media feed is full of leftists, now that, the wave, has overcome us all with their, mimicking the memes that all of us saw of gas prices when Trump left office and the inflation rate and whatnot. So, so they're claiming, whatever the inflation rate is now, as if, look at this, you won't see this again. And it's like, yeah, you're right. You won't see, over the 4 years how much everything has gone up to here, because just because it's not going up as fast doesn't mean times are good. So I think that's to your point. And it's so true. So true. They're so, I don't know, arrogant, pompous.
that's what the New York media elites tick me off. I mean, they're just absolutely the worst.
But anyway, yeah,
Back to the Monroe Doctrine, right? So China has a program that they call the Belt and Road Initiative that has spent billions and billions of dollars all throughout Africa, throughout South America and Latin America, doing infrastructure projects, just really getting these governments obligated, almost usury type interest rates, getting them obligated to China so they can control them. And it's been fascinating to watch. And sort of the U.S. disinvolvement over the last 20 years that has created this massive imbalance in sort of the U.S. influence in the region and the U.S. Power in the region versus what China has. And they're, this is the Americas. This is our doorstep. These are our neighbors, our friends, and our family members. And they were talking about Rio de Janeiro's. This is why I brought up 60 Minutes. They were talking about Rio de Janeiro's entire metro system, the transportation system, was built by the Chinese government and funded by the Chinese government and kind of negotiated with really high rates that they have to pay back. And if they don't, they take it over. They own the whole thing. The Chinese did this with the train. There was a train they built in Kenya, connecting the coast to the capital of Nairobi. And basically we're like, oh yeah. And they brought in all Chinese labor. The Africans were really upset by that. And the Chinese labor that they brought was like super racist to the Africans in Africa. And then they said, don't worry about it. You'll charge for tickets and you'll pay us back. But of course, there's not enough traffic to make the payments. So the Chinese were like, nope, this is our train. We own it. We make every penny off of it. And so this massive train rail network.
Yeah.
Is owned by.
This is not academic. I mean, this is real. I mean, I think a lot of people know I travel quite a bit back and forth to Costa Rica. And I've learned, that country itself, I think their national soccer stadium was financed and funded, by the Chinese. Some of their major roads and thoroughfares, through a very mountainous country, very important to get from one part to the next. China is involved in every corner of Central and South America and around the world, quite frankly, as you pointed out, in Africa, with either financing, funding. I think the laboring or staffing these projects is tertiary or secondary to them.
Oh, yeah.
Sure, they would love it if they not only can finance a project that they're going to own in your country, but if they can also, have Chinese nationals in your country doing the work and God knows what else, on the side.
Yeah.
It's a win-win for them. But the control that this and how it's changing, the economic makeup, of these countries and their obligation now. I mean, a burden, if you will, to getting these projects done that they owe to the Chinese. So it's real. This is not academic. And even in our backyard, I think where we see it in our industry the most is kind of in the Bahamas. I mean, I'm sure you've heard, there are a lot of projects over there being financed by them, and they'll bring in all their own workers, so it's not even helping the Bahamians or even, some of the workers and companies offshore over here in the States, that might do those projects. And so,
what I wanted to talk to you about that I find interesting, and I tried to do some research and find some articles, and I couldn't, is as the Chinese influence takes hold more and more in Latin America and South America, and as the Chinese, and I would love to do another episode with some expert or from that area, squeezes sort of the economic power of these countries. What impact will that have on illegal immigration into our country, into the U.S.? And I'm really curious to see, because they're not obviously creating jobs for natives of the countries that they're in, because they're bringing in their own labor, and then they're eventually, when the countries can't pay them back, they're going to take over ownership of the projects. In some cases, I've seen stories that projects are like half finished, because China is in the midst of having its own economic problems right now. One-child policy has really backfired on them, and they're struggling on a lot of issues. They just did a $5 trillion stimulus, which completely failed and didn't really do anything for them. So that's a whole separate conversation. But it's interesting to see that they continue to plow ahead, even with the problems they're having, because Xi Jinping has come out clearly and said world domination is the way to go, and that's their goal.
You think any of this came up in the recent conversation between, I think it was President Biden's last foreign...
With Xi Jinping?
Well, I think he was down in South America visiting with the Chinese premier, dictator, whatever they call him.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a dictator, but they call him.
That's what we call him, for sure. So, but yeah, well, I mean, you think this came up at all? Because it just...
Imagine him bringing it up. I can just imagine him trying to figure out how to continue to make deals once he leaves office.
That.
I can't. I mean...
That's what it was really about.
Yeah.
So... I'm headed out. I mean, what is it? Some meaning in the fact that that's his last foreign, visit with a foreign leader?
Yeah,
with the Chinese.
Chinese
government.
I remember, you talk about how people get recycled. I remember when I was in high school, George Bush, the father, was facing a lot of pressure to not give China most favored nation status for trading purposes, because they were deep into persecuting the Christian church. There's an underground Christian church in China, because you can, and that's not allowed, because you can only have government sanctioned religious institutions, which are more faithful to communism than anything. But there's an underground Christian movement, so American Christians are out there smuggling Bibles and trying to get support to these Christians that are living really heavily persecuted lives. And so a lot of people, a lot of congressional leaders, and I remember reading about this in high school, and he said no, he still gave China most favored nation status, right? And I've never seen a Republican stand up to China. I certainly have never seen a Democrat stand up to China, but I've never seen a Republican stand up to China until Trump came along. And it was just fascinating to me because, the guy, there's a scholar, and I can't think of his name, but he wrote a book called The 100-Year Marathon, basically about the ethnic Hans, which is what most of the Chinese are, the ethnic Hans, and their sort of belief in racial superiority, and how they are convinced they will take over the world, and how they want to control every aspect of our economic lives, right? From rare earth metals, and how they want to control trade. There's a great book called The Power of Geography by this Australian guy, talking about, and I didn't know this, like Australia, it's such a massive island, continent, but has no oil, right? All their oil is imported, and it's imported from the Chinese Sea, and I think it is called China Sea, the Great China Sea. Yeah, it has to come through the China Sea when it comes to them from the Middle East and from South America. And their biggest worry in life is that China will disrupt oil coming in, and if it does, their economy's done. Like, they got nothing, and so they rely heavily on the Americans to protect that. And China knows this. China wants to dominate that. So China's taken over all the South Pacific countries north of Australia and New Zealand, and they're building military bases, and they're building all these stuff that the Americans have ignored. And it's fascinating to me. This is why they want Taiwan. It's the biggest producer of semiconductor chips, right? And they want to take that over, because once that's done, America will be brought to its knees.
Sure.
To control the semiconductor market. But I think the American policy, this is a great map in the Wall Street Journal article, and it talks about American investment in 2002 and then American Chinese investment in 2023. And all of Latin America and South America is red. I mean, it's covered in Chinese investment. And American investment has just fallen off the cliff since 2021 to 2001.
Yeah, well, to bring the conversation full circle to the Monroe Doctrine, I mean, so what can we do about it? And what are the consequences if we don't? I mean, it's,
I mean, and I think about this because so much of our industry and people who are ABC members, they have deep connections to that part of the world. They're either from there, they have family there, shared ethnicity, shared culture. A lot of those companies are building in their home countries as well. And I think unless there's a much, much, much more greater engagement by the American government, there's much more trade support from the American government, and obviously bringing in the private sector. I think it creates a really, really bad precedent for our neighbors to the south and for the Americas. Because, I mean, think about what an isolationist, what a great way it is to isolate America, right? Like, you can't trade with your neighbors. You literally are kind of left with Canada and China. And then if you're able to kind of cut off access to technology, access to rare earth materials. I remember I saw an interview with some Princeton professor who took a year off and decided to canoe some African rivers. And he just wanted to be like away from it all and be one with nature. And he wrote this book, and how he kept finding abandoned mines all across the river that he was canoeing, and that he would find Chinese people there and Chinese companies that had just taken over abandoned mines. And we're like, well, and this is 20 years ago, and just a long game that they play with their domination, whether it's cultural or economic or political or military. And we're behind. Pete Hegseth, the new nominee I watched his podcast recently. He was on a podcast. Sean Ryan, I believe, is the host name. And he's talking about China's development of hypersonic missiles. And he's like, with 8 missiles, they can take out our fleet, our air carrier fleet. Then where are we, right? And it's fascinating to me because they are so geared towards destroying America, and America seems to think they are I don't know what Biden's exact words were, but it was like a friendly competitor, like it's in the freaking Olympics or something.
Right. Well, and to be fair, we on the Republican side and some of our leaders in the past have not been innocent in this either.
No, not at all.
It's during the campaign, I think when 4 years ago when Trump was transitioning, or no, maybe it was 8 when he was coming in, I think he was told North Korea was the biggest threat. It's very interesting because recently, obviously the president-elect and the president have had some meetings. And I think one of the news things coming out of that is that Biden had said, which again, back to given some of the connections with his family, the big guy, has said that China is the biggest threat, So I don't know if they were just positioning themselves, so that they couldn't be shown as being completely out of touch, from a foreign affairs perspective years from now, or whatnot. When what we all know, maybe is made a little more apparent,
Yeah.
But in 4 short years or 8 short years, however that much, to go from a Democrat president leaving saying North Korea is the biggest threat to Biden saying it's China. So at least that's progress, right? Even if it's for nefarious reasons, possibly, I don't know, but at least he's got the target right and he's drawn the right attention to it. So,
right.
But what we can do and what can be done, I mean, they've been working at this a long time.
Yeah, but I do take comfort in the fact that Waltz, who's the new national security advisor, is known as a China hawk. Rubio is extremely good on China.
Yes.
Hegseth is extremely good on China. So there's some leadership there that's kind of aware of the long-term ramifications of this.
Right.
And I would just tell our audience, if you're at all interested in this, is to read that book, The 100-Year Marathon. I think it'll completely blow your mind by just the strategic way that they have gone about. They have destroyed the American middle class. They have destroyed manufacturing in this country. And our elites went along with it. And now you can see 20, 30 years later.
Both sides,
On both sides. And you can see 20, 30 years later, people are pissed. They are extremely, and rightfully, they're mad because they have destroyed.
Back to being a disruptor or a positive disruptor, and who we've elected, and change is hard, for people, but we've got some serious problems, and I think this country has elected somebody that they trust and hope is going to start to address some of these things. Some of them are obviously, we got to be in it for the long haul. It's not something that's going to happen or change overnight, but you got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
Right. So
I remember congressional testimony from a general talking, this is years ago, talking about replacement parts for an Apache helicopter. And he was saying not a single part was made in the U.S. It was all coming from China.
Nuts.
And this, I know Trump has talked about onshoring and bringing companies back, especially healthcare, medicine. We learned that with COVID.
Sure. Absolutely. I think COVID started a big part of that conversation with the supply chain stuff. I was recently, on behalf of ABC, interviewed by a construction news organization, and they were asking, this is the game they're going to play, right? They wanted to know about, the tariffs that Trump's going to impose and how that's going to supply chain again, and how, whether the industry is all up in arms, and I try to do my best to, tell them this isn't an academic philosophical exercise. We have 4 years of experience where he did this. Yeah. And I think he sees it more as a tool and a negotiating tool that hopefully never has to be used. Right. But the U.S. market's pretty important, even to China, and the loss of access to this market, there's a lot of strength, in knowing that and using that in your negotiations, which I think is what, Trump does and is willing to do. To your point about we want to diversify the world supply chain, and manufacturing, right? And I think we've started this conversation. Hopefully we've got people, again, in office that are going to accelerate it. At least that's my hope. I think that's what a lot of people's hope is.
I hope so too.
But it's not going to happen overnight, to our point, right? You can't change, decades of neglect, or
and bad policy.
Overnight.
Yeah. All right. So our director's telling us we have to wrap it up. So it's been a great conversation and great catching up with you, Peter. We are very, very grateful to our audience. You're the reason we're here. Thank you for listening and honoring us with your time. We look forward to sharing another episode with you soon. And if you have any comments, please email us at theobvious@abceastflorida.com. You can find us on all the platforms. Like, click, share, subscribe. Whatever you can, if you enjoy this content, we would love to have your support. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Until next time. Ciao.